Welcome to this podcast on the history of European colonization. I am Janne Schreurs, a doctoral researcher at the KU Leuven. Together with a team of academic scholars, we are making a MOOC, a massive online open course on European history. Today, I am speaking with Idisbald Goderis. Idisbald is professor of history at the KU Leuven and teaches courses on colonial history, migration history, and the history of India and Poland. He currently examines the decolonization of the Catholic Church by studying Belgian missionaries in independent India and Congo. Today, we will talk about the question of how colonialism worked in practice. Of course, that is an immensely broad topic, so let's start with something more concrete. You recently published a book about Belgian missionaries, and the subtitle is History, Memory, Decolonization. Okay, so that's an interesting combination of words there. In which ways are missionaries related to colonization?
Yes, hello Janne. On the one hand, you can indeed say that mission is something different. Mission actually already emerged immediately after the death of Jesus Christ. The first apostles were the first missionaries. And then this went on over the following centuries. Missionaries Christianized huge parts of Europe. But then from the 16th century onwards, there's a great link between colonization and mission. Missionaries were, or clergymen, were on board of the first ships sailing to America. The church was closely involved in the conquest of what is now Latin America. And this then went on in the following centuries. Missionaries were very active in the 19th century. Actually, the church experienced a revival in the 19th century, and a whole set of new congregations were established precisely to Christianize the newly colonized regions. There was much competition also between the missionaries and their congregations. And this competition is also very typical of European colonization. So we find this within the church as well, not only within, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church, but also, and maybe even more importantly, between Catholics and Protestants. So the church, the missions were involved in many ways. Having said this, it's also important to see that there were other interests, especially on the individual level. Maybe the church had similar motivations. It was also interested in power, even in profit, but especially in power and in proselytization, whereas individual missionaries had other motivations. They wanted to do something good for the local population. They wanted to spread the word of God. They were so faithfully believing in. So this was far less about profit and power.
Okay, so there is a clear link between missionary work and colonialism, and it's interestingly very different depending on the people and the institutions. But maybe, would you say that missionaries actively contributed to the process of colonization?
Yes, indeed. So they did more than just Christianizing other continents. They were actively involved in the colonization of the new regions, and they did so in many fields. A good example is education. As a matter of fact, many colonial authorities asked missionaries to organize education for the local population. And missionaries were very interested in this, because in this way they could educate children, following Christian standards. They could combine education with Christianization. Of course, there were many differences. In some countries, missionaries especially focused on primary education, for instance, in Belgian Congo. In other countries, it was much more about the formation of an elite, for instance, in British India. Sometimes missionaries also acted against the interests of colonial authorities. For instance, in British India, there were also missionaries who focused on tribal population, on tribal groups. I wanted to educate and to Christianize them, whereas this was not in the interest of the British authorities and their allies, their local allies, namely the landowners. So, again, they collaborated, but they sometimes also acted against this interest. But independently from these differences, it is key to see that in this education, in this Christianization, missionaries also contributed to spreading colonial frameworks, colonial visions. They propagated European superiority. They were a key part of the civilizing mission, and so in this way, they were clear agents of the colonial project.
You said in the beginning of your answer that they contributed in many ways, and you gave the example of education. So, are there other ways next to education in which they further contributed?
Oh yeah, definitely. Very close to education is, for instance, also science. Many missionaries were also active as scientists. They wrote dictionaries. They studied ethnicities. They were pioneers in colonial ethnography. Maybe not, but few of them went that far as anthropologists who also measured human skulls and wanted to prove the superiority of the white race. Missionaries did ethnography and linguistics in a different way, but nevertheless, even in this way, they also contributed to what is another very typical feature of European colonization, namely the classification of ethnic groups and linguistic groups. So they divided population in categories that were no longer interlinked. And of course, there were differences between population groups before the arrival of the Europeans, but Europeans made them absolute and introduced censuses and even created new languages, making a standard language out of various dialects. And in this field, missionaries also played a key role.
So, missionaries and education, missionaries and science. I must say that in general, I associate missionaries in the colonies with hospitals and healthcare.
Yeah, that's another field indeed. And maybe also a gendered one, because there we find also many female missionaries. And when thinking of missionaries, we always first think of the typical male missionary with a long beard. But in many places there were even more female missionaries than male missionaries, and these female missionaries, they were, for instance, very active in healthcare. They were assigned particular roles, for instance, also girls' education, but also the nursery and childcare and working in hospitals and so on and so forth. So, missionaries in many colonies were key in healthcare. Again, they did so to win the souls, to convince the local populations of the benefit of Christianity, of the superiority of Europeans. In a certain way, you could say they helped a lot, so they cured a lot of people. But it is more complicated than that, because healthcare also had its minuses, its other sides. Healthcare was not always that well developed as one would think here in Europe. Actually, it was part of colonial propaganda, and we or people in Europe were raised with many pictures of modern hospitals. And this colonial propaganda still matters today, still influences the way how many Europeans think of colonial history. But what is not always said is that this healthcare was very selective, was only developed in those regions that were economically interesting, only addressed those diseases that were curable. And one also needs to know that Europeans did not only heal people, they also spread diseases. And in some colonies, one can even say that Europeans made more people ill than healthy. So healthcare, along with missionaries, actually I'm already talking about other aspects of colonization than just the mission, but healthcare has it's more complicated than propaganda often suggests.
Trade was a very important aspect of colonial economies. But I wonder, was that something new, or what was it that defined the colonialist aspect in a colonial economy?
Yeah, that's of course, that's a very good question, because indeed trade had existed since all time, since humankind. But colonial trade was different because of the inequality between the two partners. Europe was industrialized, at least in the modern times, and imposed its systems, its prices, its products on its colonies, on the rest of the world. Not only in the colonies, also elsewhere. Think of China. And if China did not agree, if countries such as China did not agree, well, then there was gunboat diplomacy. So they forced those countries to accept European conditions. And on top of that, of course, it was not only trading, it was also looting, it was plundering, it was withdrawing natural resources, for which all the profits went to Europe. Also before the modern era, before industrialization. In America, one found gold and silver and transported this to Europe and made a lot of money with this. And then gold rushes continued to exist also in Australia, in South Africa in the 19th century, but gradually also other natural resources came in, such as rubber in the Belgian or Congo Free State, so in Central Africa in the late 19th century, palm oil in West Africa, the Niger Delta, different ores from which one could extract metals such as copper, tin. So mining was a very important branch of the colonial economy, and this was no longer trade. This was just the export of these products to Europe at very profitable prices. Profitable prices also because these products were collected via forced labor, via low wages. So this was a very unequal economic system.
And these sources were then, these sources of income were sufficient to sustain the colonial system?
Yes, definitely, but one never had enough. So there were always other ways to make even more money. For instance, and there was great variety in this, dependently on the conditions of the colonies, of the regions Europeans were arriving in. So, for instance, in some places, think of India, taxation of agriculture was also very important. And then the British found different ways to levy taxes on agriculture. But elsewhere, Europeans started their own agriculture. And this is then the rise of huge plantations, sugar plantations, tobacco, cotton plantations, rubber plantations also. Sugar and tobacco in the early modern age, rubber and other things in the late 19th and in the 20th century. And these plantations again yielded a lot of profits. Actually, they also transformed local economies. And even nowadays, quite a lot of countries are featured by single crop production. For instance, Uganda has coffee, Cuba has sugar, and this still nowadays is very important in local agriculture, in export, and so on. And what is even more interesting is that some of these products came from other continents. So they were really introduced in those places and then cultivated and with an impact up to today.
So, talking about economy, I've heard you say, or I've heard you describe an economic system of exploitation, but you've also mentioned elements such as education and healthcare. So this brings me to a current debate on the colonial past, in which it is a recurring argument that today's world inequalities are rooted in this colonial past, and that European countries became very rich due to colonization. But then there are other voices that maintain that European investment in colonies overweighed this process. What is your take in this?
Yeah, it goes without saying that Europe made a lot of money via colonization, but also in other ways that are often underestimated or eclipsed by the more visible profits. I think of monetary policy, fiscal policy. In these ways too, European metropoles exploited their colonies. Of course, they will then refer to the benefits for the colonies, to their investments, to the progress in economy, in living standard, in life expectancy, and so on and so forth. So, which is also correct, but at the end of the day, all of this, as I already explained when talking about healthcare, was about Europe, was in European interest. Also the infrastructure. So it is true that Europeans build a lot of highways and railroads and so on and so forth. But this was only to stimulate further economic development. And in some colonies, take for instance Belgian Congo, there were no railroads between the largest cities. It was only railroads to ports, and then in order to take all of these natural resources to Europe. So and this clearly demonstrate that European interests were at the core of the whole enterprise.
So there were investments, but these investments served the interest of Europe. Then one can only wonder, how could such a colonialist system be imposed on so many people? How did that work?
I think that violence can explain this. There was much violence, and this is often forgotten. But in all of the stages of European colonization, there was violence. In the conquest, this really went together with a lot of wars, wars that have slipped into oblivion here in Europe. But I'm not talking about dozens. It's really about hundreds of wars in Africa, in Asia. Some of them lasted for decades. Some just a couple of battles. But Europeans were military superior, so they had weapons. Local populations couldn't compete with, and those battles ended. In thousands of casualties at the local side, and just 2, 3, 4 European deaths at the European side. So there was violence in the conquest, but there was also violence in the rule. After having conquered a territory and having obtained recognition, diplomatic recognition from the other European powers, colonial authorities then had to what they called pacify the colony. But this is actually a synonym or a euphemism for further violence, and there were a lot of military campaigns every year to crush rebellion, to restore order, and then at a more hidden level, there was also much violence in the ruling itself. So there was much segregation, much racism. It was all about controlling the local population, which eventually was no match to the Europeans.
But it remains very remarkable. Whole societies were defeated or controlled by a comparatively small group of Europeans. It seems very hard to sustain a system based on mere force.
Yes, and there were other things as well. So violence was one, but then, for instance, diseases. And it's very famous, for instance, about the demographic consequences of the conquest of America. It's the local population was literally decimated, and this again occurred in the 19th century. In Tasmania, for instance, all of the local population died, was completely wiped out, not as an accident, but as a consequence of a deliberate policy to weaken the Aboriginals, or to weaken local population. So diseases, but then also, one found allies among local populations who, some rulers or ethnic groups indeed sided with the colonizers. On the one hand, because there was no better option. On the other hand, also because they thought Europeans could help them in defeating enemies or establishing or strengthening their position, and so on. And then the Europeans used these allies, these alliances, with a policy that is often referred to as divide and rule. So just as the Romans did it, so they created division, dissent among local populations in order then to better rule.
So you could say that colonialism completely changed the world. What was the impact of colonialism in a broader sense?
Yeah, I already mentioned how plantation economy, for instance, transformed the economy of colonies. I gave the examples of Uganda and Cuba, but it goes so much further than that. Also demography. I mentioned that whole populations were killed, and then they were replaced by other groups. First, black slaves, African slaves. Then later also indentured labor. So when slavery was abolished in the 19th century, those plantations needed cheap labor, and so then they brought people from, for instance, from India or from China to the colonies, coolies and so on and so forth. These people then intermixed. Not all of them, of course, but so actually many colonial societies, especially in America, are way more diverse than here in Europe, and we Europeans struggle with migration, but we forget that we caused much more migration elsewhere. But it even goes further than that. Also, borders. Almost all of, quite a lot of borders in the world, so between states, were drawn in the colonial era by colonizers, not taking into account local geographical or ethnic boundaries, but just thinking of their own interests. Also place names, and we all know that New York or New Zealand refer to the English city of York and the Dutch province of Zeeland, but it goes much further. Rio de Janeiro means River of January, so the estuary was discovered between quotation marks. It was first seen by Europeans in the month of January. Venezuela means Little Venice, so even there you see that there's so much impact. Also in food, I mentioned the triangular trade, but maybe I should also note the Columbian exchange. So a lot of products that were typical for Europe, Asia, Africa were introduced in America, and the other way around. And the fact that we now have tomatoes or chocolate or tobacco, well, this is also due to colonization. So colonization affected European, but also non-European lives in the most tremendous way, beyond imagination.
Okay, a very broad answer to, of course, a very broad question. And we've started with a difficult one. We started with the question how colonialism functions in practice. And we've highlighted several aspects. Could you maybe, at the end of this interview, summarize the main practices that sustained colonial societies?
Oops, that's maybe the most difficult question. Yeah, but I'll try to sum up. So, on the one hand, there's this civilizing mission, at least in European eyes. So there were aspects such as education and healthcare and the building of infrastructure. On the other hand, this was in the service of, or also to hide the real interests of colonization, namely economy, and then this covers many fields, so both trade and the extraction of natural resources and exploitation and taxation and so on and so forth. This went very far, so included forced labor, slavery, and so on, and was imposed on local societies with a great deal of violence, segregation, racism, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much, Elisabeth, for this interesting and pleasant conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you.